So our third presentation of the UAS session, Drew Baustian for MicaSense. Drew leads the sales team at MicaSense and has been with the company since 2016. His past experience includes sales at an ag tech startup, installation and support for precision ag dealer, field scouting for a seed company, and growing up on a corn, soybean, and hog farm in good old Iowa. So without further ado, here's Drew Baustian presenting on using drone-based multi-spectral imaging for land management. Thanks, Drew.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great.
Yeah, you sound great.
So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Give me a second here. Okay, can you see this okay?
Yep, looks good. Thank you.
Great, excellent. Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. Hopefully, I can use the next little bit of time to give you guys some information on multispectral imaging. So just some background on MicaSense, the company. If you're not familiar with us, we make multispectral cameras, really hardware focused. In that picture, you can see how our red edge camera has evolved over time. So the closest one is second generation red edge. The farther one is red edge 3. Then we go to red edge M, and then the most recent one, red edge MX. So just kind of a fun picture of how we've been changing over time. So we're based in Seattle, Washington. We develop multispectral imaging hardware. We're really focused on 4 end user groups. So we primarily sell to researchers, so that could be academic or commercial researchers, government entities. So we do a lot of work with the USDA, the USGS, a lot of government entities like that. We work in corporate agriculture a little bit. So if there's a large agricultural entity, generally they have an R&D wing, and that's where they're trying our cameras out for production purposes. And then we also sell to service providers, so drone service providers who are kind of servicing the above 3 groups. So what I'm going to do today is go through some of the science behind multispectral imaging, so you have a baseline there, and then I'll show you our 3 product lines and give you an idea as to what each one of those products is capable of doing. And then we'll spend the bulk of our time just looking at some example data sets of how our multispectral imagery has been used for land management purposes. Primarily, I do have some agricultural examples towards the end that I can get into if we have time. But what does a multispectral camera actually capture? So this little diagram on the right-hand side is just showing sunlight coming down, hitting a plant canopy. Some of that light gets absorbed by the plant, some of it gets transmitted, and then some of it gets reflected. So the light that gets reflected off the plant is what our camera is capturing in the visible and the near infrared. So it's a passive sensor. And what we're looking at on when it comes to plant canopies is basically this plant reflectance profile that you're looking at on this graph here. So the graph itself, so we're looking at percentage reflectance from 0 to 50%. So if something has 0% reflectance, that probably means it's really dark. If something has 50% or higher reflectance, that means it's really bright. And then on the x-axis, we're looking at the visible portion of the light spectrum, and then the near infrared portion. And inside that graph are 2 lines. One line, the green line, is representing typical reflectance profile of a healthy plant canopy. So if you follow that line from left to right, and you think about a plant, it's basically absorbing a lot of blue light and a lot of red light, and that light goes into the photosynthetic process if it's healthy. And then green actually has a little bit of a higher reflectance, and that's why when we go outside and we look at trees in the summertime, if they're healthy, they generally look green. As the leaves start to die, as that tree transitions into the fall, generally that red light is not getting absorbed as much because the leaves aren't healthy and it's getting reflected. And so that's the reason why trees change colors in the fall, is because they're reflecting more lights in yellow and red than they were before when they were absorbing it. So this is just an example of how plant reflectance shifts depending on a plant's health, essentially. So typically what we see is a higher reflectance in red when a plant is stressed, because it's not absorbing that light effectively. And then it has actually a decrease in reflectance intensity in the near infrared. So that's true for a number of reasons. If a plant's going through different growth stages, it's going to have different reflectance values at different points along this spectrum. If it's going through a nutrient deficiency, it's going to have a shift in reflectance. If it has a water deficiency or a water excess, it's going to have a reflectance response. So really any kind of physiological change in a plant canopy is going to impact its reflectance. And so what we do with a multispectral camera is we're capturing specific points along this plant reflectance profile, and we're looking at each one of those points in terms of the image's percentage reflectance. So each one of the pixels in that image has a value, and we're looking at those values and determining, basically making an assumption on the status of that plant canopy. So this right here is our Red Edge MX camera. So it's essentially has 5 spectral bands. So we've got one at blue, at green, at red edge, and then at near infrared. So we're, let me go back here. We're basically capturing those 5 points along the plant's reflectance profile to better understand what's going on in a plant canopy. So yeah, that's one of our products, the Red Edge. So it's 5 spectral bands. We really heavily emphasize radiometric calibration at MicaSense. So what that means is if lighting conditions change from day to day, we're essentially getting a calibration point with this calibration panel you see here. And we're also taking light change measurements over the course of the flight. So this little light sensor is mounted on top of the drone. We're using those 2 inputs to basically normalize the data set. And so if you're trying to get an understanding of how a field or a tree is changing over time, you need to radiometrically calibrate so you're comparing apples to apples, because one day might be sunny, one day might be cloudy. You want to see how the plant's changing. You don't want to see how the light is changing on a given day. So that's basically the importance of radiometric calibration. Another one of our product lines is the Altum. So this is a higher resolution version of the Red Edge. So this is able to get about 4 centimeters per pixel spatial resolution at 100 meters AGL, whereas the Red Edge is more like 7. So if you're more interested in really granular spatial resolution data, the Altum's the better choice. And then another thing that's unique about the Altum is that it's actually also capturing a thermal layer. So we have a thermal imager in this camera from FLIR, and we're able to align the multispectral and the thermal data so that you can easily compare the visible, the near infrared, and then the thermal data on a particular area. And I'll show you some examples of that in a little bit. And then the third and final product in our product family is the dual camera system. So what we did here was we essentially just took the Red Edge MX, the first camera that I showed you, and we created 5 new filters to capture 5 new spectral bands, and we call it the Red Edge MX Blue. And then we paired those together so that they're synchronized in their capture. So every time the camera triggers, it's taking 10 images, and then we can align those 10 images, and we've got a 10-band data set instead of a 5-band data set. And the reason we chose the bands that we did is actually because they're very well aligned with Sentinel-2 and Landsat-8 satellite data. So this is something that a lot of researchers and people in conservation have been asking from us for quite a while. So they're wanting to correlate satellite and drone-based data, just to kind of get like spot checks, or like the equivalent of looking at a small area and then trying to extrapolate that out over the course of a larger area with Sentinel-2 or Landsat data. So this is kind of a niche product, but we just launched it last year, and it's really exceeded our expectations in terms of adoption. But it's really for people who have a really specific application desire, like they want to find a specific plant species, or maybe like some sort of disease in a crop research project. So yeah, it's kind of a niche product. So when it comes to putting these drones on or putting these cameras on a drone, I don't know if I mentioned before, but our cameras are specifically designed to be mounted onto drone-based systems. There's lots of options. So I'd say that for better or for worse, the majority of our users are flying DJI drones. So here you can see our integration kit for the M300. And we've also got integrations for the M200, the M600, the M100, the Inspire 2, the Inspire 1, basically any kind of DJI drone except for maybe a Phantom or a Mavic is going to be able to carry our cameras. But in addition to the DJI drones, we also have a number of fixed wing partners. So these are really the four most notable ones. So the Wingtra one from Wingtra, the Quantum Systems Trinity, the EB, and then the Marlin from Atmos. So most of those are vertical takeoff and landing drones. But if you're trying to cover a larger area, typically people are going for those fixed wing drones. So the workflow for using our data is basically simplified into this breakdown. So you basically set the camera up on the drone to capture, to start capturing once the drone's in the air. You use a drone mission planner to control the drone flight path. After the flight, the drone lands, you take the SD card or the USB stick out of the camera. The Red Edge has an SD card. The Altum has a USB stick. And then you'll process those TIFF files into an orthomosaic, and then you'll analyze the data. So let's imagine that all four of those first steps have happened, and now we're looking at the data, the example data. So I'll just give you a few. We can run through a few of these real life examples just to give you an idea of the application types. So this is actually a false color composite from the dual camera system. So we're basically just visualizing probably something like one of the near infrared bands, one of the red edge bands, and then probably like one of the blue bands to get a different perspective on a plant canopy. So this is just a forested area and then kind of an open pasture area. And you can see that these trees probably were all green in the original image, but if we use a false color composite, you can delineate more clearly between the species. So one species type is showing up as orange, another one is showing up as blue. So if you're looking for like image classification type applications, the dual camera system does that really well. This is just an example of how you can use that the dual camera system to correlate very well with satellite data. So yeah, I think the one thing that jumps out to you when you look at this is just the difference in the spatial resolution, right? The Sentinel data is of course much more coarse. It has much larger pixels versus ours. You're looking at pixels that are a meter or more in size versus ours, which are 8 centimeters per pixel. But the important thing, and what our researchers really care about, is the fact that the reflectance data is more or less the same. So the spectral bands that the dual camera is capturing are identical to the spectral bands that the Sentinel-2 is capturing. So like maybe, for example, you see something that you're interested in the satellite data, and that prompts you to go out and fly a smaller area with the drone and get more detailed information on that spot. Or vice versa, you could take the more detailed spot and and somehow train the satellite data to do something based off of the information you're getting on the more granular information from the drone. This is just an example of the Altum data. So this is just an area that I flew outside my parents' place, actually. And what we've got here is just a little clump of forest, and then you've got bare field all around it. And then there's this little stream that runs through into here. And what I wanted to do was I basically wanted to see if I could use the Altum thermal data to better understand where the water is going underneath this tree canopy. And so this is a false color composite. I think it's CIR. So I think it's using near infrared red and blue, or near infrared red and green. And this is a good tool to use to try to identify where the water's at. And I think it helps us when we visualize it this way. Usually the water shows up as like gray or black. So it gives you a little bit of better understanding of where the water's going. But if I add in the thermal layer and I kind of hone in on the values that are representing where the water's at and the water values, it gives me some interesting insight into where it's pooling up, or maybe where the ground is wet. So you can just see more clearly where the stream's going. There's probably some water standing here, and then there's also another chute that goes up to the north. So if you're looking for information on where water's at, actually I got an example for basically looking for mosquito habitats in a couple slides from here, but this can be useful. Yeah, right here. So this is actually a data set out of Thailand. And what they wanted us to do was basically identify all the areas where it's very highly likely that there's mosquito breeding going on, so they can go out and spray for mosquitoes. And so what we did was we essentially just took the data set they gave us, and first we classified where all the water was at. So this is essentially just taking the data set and isolating where the water is located and basically classifying the image as the blue is water. We also classified all the man-made stuff. So like the buildings and places where people would frequent, because that's another area where applying some sort of insecticide for mosquito control would be important. And then we took that data set and we took that information and we created a heat map, which basically would be a guide to anybody who's doing the application on where they should be applying it and where maybe it's not that important to apply it. So this is something that seems like it's becoming more and more of interest, especially like in the southern states, like in Florida, where they do a lot of mosquito prevention type applications. So I think this is probably going to grow in interest over time, especially as the drone spraying element gets added in. The next couple are water-related applications. So this is an example of showing how you can use the data to essentially track activity of algae growth over the course of the summer. So basically what we did here is we flew these man-made lakes, and we did manual digitization of it. So we basically just isolated the water, because we didn't want to classify the whole image. We just wanted to classify the sections with water in them. And then we just clipped the multispectral data to these polygons representing the lakes, and then we numbered them. So just 1 through 12. And what we did was we flew it 2 times. So we flew it early summer, and then we flew it in the spring, and then we flew it in the summer. And so what we're doing here is for the spring flight, we're looking at where the algae is most prevalent, and we basically just classified it with this pinkish purple color. I guess it's a pink color. I'll go with pink. And then And in the summertime, we classified it again. So basically tried to understand how much it's progressed from spring to summer. And then what we could do at that point is basically look at the first flight and then look at the second flight and categorize like what was there before in the spring, what was there later in the summer, and then what's just been consistently there from spring to summer. And then if you're interested in basically algae management, algae bloom management, you can basically, with that information, you can basically identify where the algae growth has been most intense, or where it's been less intense, and then take action on that information. So this next one is another aquatic example. So this is milfoil detection. So water milfoil spreads rapidly, forming mats of vegetation on the water surface. And the mats, like from a practical standpoint, they just interfere with recreational activities. So if it's like on a recreational lake, it would be a pain to deal with. Another thing is that it also breeds mosquitoes. It causes a good environment for mosquito breeding. So if you're trying to quantify the area that needs to be treated to get rid of the milfoil, we can use multispectral imagery to help with that process as well. So this is a data set from the 10-band camera. We're looking at an RGB composite up there, and then we use a custom composite to better understand where the milfoil is occurring. So you can see that using a custom composite, sometimes you can get that aquatic weed to pop a little better and stand out a bit more, because in the RGB, it's a little bit unclear on the fringes as to whether it's present or not. But then we look at the 10.7.3, which is actually near infrared is 10, and then red edge is 7, and then I think green is 3. And then we can take that composite and we can basically just classify it. We can classify what's the milfoil, what's not the milfoil, and then that's the output that gets delivered to whoever is interested in this. It's just basically like, hey, look at all the pink area. That's where the milfoil's at. Go take care of it. And you can do other things like planning. You know, if you can classify where all the milfoil's at, then you have an idea as to like what's the surface area or what's the area of milfoil. If you're going to plan to get rid of it or make an application, it's information that helps you understand how much herbicide that you need to use, or whatever they call stuff that they spray in the water to treat weeds. And maybe it's not herbicide, maybe it's like aquaticide or something. Not really sure. Yeah, and these are just other example composites that you can create, basically doing the same thing. And then this is using an index instead of a composite to see the vegetation activity, biomass activity. So this example is a boreal peatland reclamation project in Alberta. So this is that process. I don't know if you guys have heard of it, but it's they do it in Canada, where they basically just I think it's called like oil sand or something like that, where they pull oil from the soil, and it's really hard on the environment. And one of the steps in this process is like remediation post like mining of the soil. They have to basically try to bring it back to where it was before. And so one of our customers with the Altum was basically using it to classify plant species and identify and quantify the native plant species as they were returning to an area that they were trying to reclaim. So basically, instead of going out and doing hand scouting, we're basically just drop a big rectangular frame onto the ground and then count manually all the different types of plants in there, and then make an assumption as to what the population is of each one of those species. They basically use remote sensing to to basically do that en masse instead of manually. So this one is identifying a couple of different weeds in a spearmint field. So this is, as you can tell, this is an irrigation pivot. I think we did this in the state of Washington. So they were growing spearmint for, gosh, I think it was like essential oils or something like that. And basically, if there's a lot of this this thistle in the crop, then it decreases the value of the harvest. And basically what we did with the data was we just classified it. We identified where all the thistle patches were and the wild mustard, and then classified it so that the managers of the field knew exactly where the small patches were popping up. So some of this stuff is obvious. You can see like this big patch right here, this big patch right here. We can see that with RGB data, but some of the other stuff that's like really small is much more difficult to discern. And if you have the classification kind of algorithm honed in, it's basically going to reveal all this stuff without you having to strain your eyes and identify it all manually. And so basically what this allows you to do is go to those spots, because they're all georeferenced, and wipe out all those little weed patches before they become a bigger weed patch like these two over here. And then this is just a GIF that we put together to help you visualize before or after the classification, just to see where all those weed patches are at. And then, you know, stand counting, that's a big thing these days. We've been looking into how we can get into the forestry industry. And one thing that's happening and that is part of the forestry process is they basically plant these seedlings, and then a few years later they come back and try to get a stand count of those seedlings. And I think a lot of times they're doing it with ATVs, and the seedlings can die for any number of reasons. They get choked out by weeds, or you know, maybe a deer comes and eats them or something. And it's pretty difficult to get an accurate count. And so that's just something that we can do with this data, or anybody can do with this data, is just basically train an algorithm like this to basically classify out each one of the plants and then count the plants. And then one of the last things that I was planning on showing was just, you know, I saw the previous presenter was showing some LiDAR 3D reconstruction and probably some high-res RGB reconstruction, which it's generally going to beat out our cameras, to be candid, just because they're not designed to be high resolution, high spatial resolution. They're more designed for high spectral quality and radiometric accuracy. But I thought this was kind of impressive. So this is a pasture, again, out at my family's farm place that I flew with our Altum camera. And I thought the 3D model was actually pretty decent. So I'll try playing that. Hopefully it works for you guys. But so I think this was captured at like 100 meters. But you can see like there's a little stream that runs through the middle. And this is a bare field, this is a pasture. And what you can do with the Altum is you can take that 3D model and you can apply the thermal layer to it. Let's see, here we go. So I basically just applied the thermal over top of the 3D model, and you can do the same thing. So it's just a way to visualize the area that you flew over. So of course, the creek is going to be the coldest spot because that's running water. The pasture is a little cooler or a little warmer, but it's not as warm as the bare soil. And then there's, of course, a road right here. So that's going to be really hot because it's just cement. But just kind of some interesting ways to visualize the data. Looks like I have maybe I'll just show you a few of these agricultural examples, and then I'll leave a few minutes for questions if there are any. So this is a rice field in Argentina, and what we did here was, or what the end user did was, he basically flew it after a third party did a fertilizer application, and what we saw in the NDRE, well, I guess if we go back to the RGB, sometimes if any of you guys have done a lot of drone flying, sometimes if there's stitching issues, there can be stripes in the data. And so we saw these stripes across the field, and we thought that it was probably a stitching issue at first, or maybe like a sunspot in the data or something like that. But then when we looked at the NDRE data set, which is correlated with chlorophyll content, we saw that the stripes are actually going in a bunch of different directions. So that kind of rules out stitching issues or sunspots. Not entirely, but because I guess your drone could be flying in different directions causing those stripes. But I mean, it's pretty suspect when the striping is basically correlating with the path of the fertilizer applicator. So what's kind of interesting here is like two things are basically revealed. One is the applicator itself wasn't applying the fertilizer in a uniform manner. It was putting a lot down right in the middle of its paths, but it wasn't distributing it far enough across the path. So you're getting these high growth areas that kind of peter out in between the paths. And then another thing we discovered was that there's like a 20 or 30 acre chunk of this field that that didn't get any application at all. And it just so happens that the road runs across this side. And so what we suspect is basically the person applying got this far, ran out of fertilizer, and was just like, it's not much field left. I think I'm just gonna call it good. So it's just a way to basically hold accountable whoever's doing third-party applications in the field. This is a hemp data set that was captured in Illinois, and I just wanted to show you like another basically species differentiation capability. So this is the RGB composite, and then I made a custom composite to try to draw out the different plant species. And if we look closely, you can see that it really does a good job of delineating between the hemp crop and then the weeds that are growing in that field. I wish I'd grabbed a shot of the RGB close up, but you can kind of get an idea just by looking at this, like this area right here. It all looks pretty uniform and green. When you use the custom composite, it draws out the weeds that show up as a different color. And then I just zoom in on that, and you can see the hemp versus the weed patch. This is a peach orchard in California where we basically just created zones based on the weak spots with the chlorophyll map, and then the farm manager did a nitrogen application based on that, and then you can see the before and after of that effect. So basically the field improved quite a bit from May 3rd to August 2nd after the application. Getting back to the Altum data, so this is just an example of how you can identify irrigation leaks with the thermal data. So here's the RGB, you look at the thermal, and there's a bunch of black spots, which basically represent cold spots all across the field. Yeah, and then NDRE is just showing us kind of vigor in those areas. So the thought process was that the areas with the most vigor that also correlated with the irrigation leak were probably the irrigation leaks that were occurring the longest, causing a physiological change to the plant. I think this might be the last one. So this is just flood irrigation. So this is a crop water stress index that's based on ground sensors, I think. And then this is the Altum thermal output. So the takeaway here was just that they're very highly correlated. This one was just using drone data. This was using a bunch of other inputs. Yeah, I think that's it for, that's all I have for for multispectral imaging. Does anybody have any questions?
We have one question came in the chat. What software do you recommend for processing the ultimate imagery?
I would recommend, so I always use Agisoft, Agisoft Metashape. I think that it does the best job of processing the data. But you can also use Pix4D or Pix4D Fields or Correlator, SimActive Correlator 3D. A lot of different software processors handle our data. So yeah, well, if there are any other questions, thanks for your time, and appreciate coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Drew. If anybody does have any other questions, please feel free to still ask them because we do have a couple more minutes, and I'm not sure if Gene's on the call yet. But yeah, Drew, thank you very much for your presentation. I'm pretty sure Scott has an Ultim and I have an Ultim as well, and those
Awesome.
Those are interesting to see this presentation, see a little bit more of the technology and everything.
That's great to
Thank
hear.
you.